This is sin, and I think it's the fifth or sixth session. I'll have to check, but it is sin from late medieval period to the contemporary period, which we will look at as being up to say the 1950s ish. I did want to. Last week we ended with a few things, a few comments just about the way sin was being shaped, sort of from the 11th century to the 13th century, the different categories that were coming out, the emphasis on confession, penance, and sanctification that came through writings like Thomas Aquinas, and whose major work was the Summa Theologia, and it outlined. It was the first sort of full. It was the first sort of systematic. It wasn't systematic, but it was the first sort of full treatment of spirituality and of theology, and defined for the Western Church a little bit more in more certain terms the sacraments, and it also introduced something called indulgences, which we're going to talk about here shortly. And indulgences play a major role, but within Aquinas's understanding of sin, you have those early categories that we just briefly touched on last week, and those are the hinge points for this week: is the mortal sins, the venial sins, and the notion of original sin. Now, original sin, again, pretty much throughout the history of Western theology, around Latin theology, you have the original sin always sort of being a part of it, that has been established by Augustine in the 5th century, and it carries to the present. Everything we think about sin ultimately boils down to Augustine's understanding or interpretation of Paul. But in Aquinas's schema, we have mortal sins, and those were the sins that lead to damnation. And for many, that is looked at as a rejection of God. And sin is still a little squishy, where what fits who determine what sins fit where. Remember what I said, that the 7 deadly sins are not in the Bible. Those are things that were constructed by Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century, and then were used by Western monasticism to spread, to sort of guide the base levels of sin. Well, when we get to the medieval period, and you have Aquinas defining these, you have the mortal sins again that lead to damnation. But they're looked at of a basis of rejection of God, of saying, I don't want anything to do with God. I'm going to, in the face of God, commit murder. I'm going to lie boldly. I'm going to reject God in my life. This isn't blasphemy where there's no coming back. There is still coming back. And in that schema, the sacrament of penance could be ushered, and you could be forgiven. But they also looked at the different, and we talk about, there are different types of sins and the effects of sins versus the existential effect of sin. So we can be forgiven and we can have a sense of restoration in ourselves, but that doesn't mean that the effects of that sin don't carry on. You murder someone, you may be forgiven by God, you may even be forgiven by the victim's family, but at the end of the day, that victim is still not there, and the effects of that sin carry on. So that is for the Western. I don't say Catholic because it really wasn't Catholic at this point. It was, they would have understood themselves as Catholic, but in the universal sense of Catholic, and that split in 1054 of the Great Schism, the Pope saying, I am the greatest among equals, and we have this split between the East and the West. So at this point, it's the Western Church, or the Latin Church, or what eventually would be understood, or is understood, as the Roman Church. But you don't have that definitive Roman Catholic understanding that we project on it, and really until the Reformation. And when the Counter-Reformation happens, you have that emergence of Roman Catholic identity over and against Protestant theology. But you can use the word Catholic, but it really is more just sort of saying, I live in the West. I see Rome as the center of my faith expression, not Constantinople or not Eastern Orthodoxy. Venial sins, those are lesser sins, those are shortcomings, those are where we're weak. They're often considered a turning away from God, but not a rejection of God. So they're lighter in their feeling, and it's important because those are, some called it an unhealthy attachment to creatures in this world, or to the creaturely desires, or to the natures of this world. So those sins, and we'll see that in Dante's in Divine Comedy, the notion of some sins, and actually some of the things we might think that maybe, like lust, we think, oh, that's a pretty bad one. Well, lust, even for Dante, was kind of put in the you're weak people. and it's not considered in this direct rebellion against God. Now we see that in a flip narrative today. We might put sexual sins in our current culture as pretty high, like those are the ultimate sins. But you can also say that's a preoccupation or an overemphasis of the nature of sexuality in our culture. Again, we talked about the original sin inherited. With the venial sins, so mortal sins can be forgiven, but they still stick with you. And we'll talk about this in terms of the notion of hell and the 9 levels of the inferno are understood. You start to see why purgatory was necessary. But purgatory for the sins that were committed, that weren't spoken in forgiveness, that weren't received in forgiveness, and they weren't confessed, you can burn those off in purgatory. Purgatory is like a big spiritual treadmill, and until you get to the right calorie, until you get to the right weight, you're not going on from there. All right, that was just a little bit of recap from last week. What we have, though, as we move into sin after this period. So right now we're sort of in that 1200, 1300 period. And remember, the Reformation is coming at 1500, and the printing press is invented in 1440. So you have a number of things happening in this 200 to 300 year period. One, you have the first time you have a more what's called scholasticism, which is a the sort of first real systemization of theology and of thinking about God, what we call second order theology. And in this, you have an elevation of literature as a whole, elevation of writing. There are scholarship is being raised. And then when you have that coinciding with the invention of the printing press in the 1440s, you start to have literature being dispersed. But one of the documents that actually I think is probably the most profound theological document to affect our understanding of sin, to affect the movement of the church, I think the very thing that predicated the notion of why the Reformation came about was Dante's writing of the Divine Comedy. I think it is one of the most significant and arguably erroneous texts. And it did more to shape our understanding of hell. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, we talked about hell, and there are multiple, I don't remember how many, 4 or 5 words in Greek and Hebrew total that have nuances of this Gehenna, of this, of Hades, of this sort of limbo, of places that throughout the Old Testament, the Apocrypha, and the New Testament that mention some variation of some underworld that King James just is like hell for everyone. That's hell, that's hell, that's hell, that's hell, that's hell. And that's 1600s, so that's a couple hundred years after the printing press and several hundred years, and 300-400 years after Dante's Inferno, or his Divine Comedy. But you couple those two together, and over a period of about 300 or 400 years, you have the shaping of a mindset around what sin is and what the consequences of sin are. And this ultimately has the effect of shaping how we move forward from the Reformation in our terms of piety, in our terms of rejection of the Catholic Church as reformers. And so what we want to look at is, I want to take a pause and I want to look at the Divine Comedy. Dante, his last name, which I didn't even know because I never really thought about it, I just always think of him as Dante, is Algiers, or Algier, Alighir. Never heard of it, don't really care, but you might want to know for those of you. Born 1265 to 1321, and around this period you have Saint Bart of Clairvaux. You have this huge monastic renewal going on. I've said this before, throughout the history of the Western Church, you have renewals in monasticism, because as monasteries became more catering to the nobility, to the wealthy, they became less about prayer. And then every time you have 3 or 4 of these throughout the history of the last 2,000 years, where the monastics said, we've lost the emphasis. Our basic call is work and prayer. And when they start divvying out the work, which is why I have a strong emphasis on, yes, we work hard in the hiker meals, we look hard in the hiker weeks, because we're called to serve, we're called to work, we're called to do things. So you have Dante in the midst of this. He's a poet, he's a writer, he's a philosopher. He was called his writing lesser known, and I didn't have any idea of this actually, but he wrote a piece called "The Eloquence of the Vernacular," and arguably he wrote into most things that were written up to this point were written in certain forms and ways. And when we think of writing, there's no hold bars. Like you can't tell me to capitalize. Bell hooks. I'm going to make my name lowercase. Everything. Screw the system. But he kind of did that in an eloquent way. But he wrote in defense of basically the common voice. And what's interesting about that is he was from Florence. He was Divine Comedy is thought to be the piece of literature that established the Tuscan language as the normative language for modern day Italy. So you arguably, the Divine Comedy was the most pivotal piece for what we know as modern day Italian. It's considered one of the greatest pieces of Western literature. It's a narrative poem that walks the person in their soul, and it's his observations as he goes from the lowest pits of hell in the Inferno to the Purgatorio, this stage where people are refined from their sins that they committed in the world that they didn't confess and that are still there, or that they did confess and the guilt of the sin was removed, but the consequences or the culpability of it, and so they had to work on that treadmill in the middle. Again, for those of you Lost fans, they argue that. I think we're kind of in purgatory now. And then the last one is paradise, and that's the sort of the last ascent. You're guided in the Divine Comedy by three characters. Virgil, who was a Roman poet, and he is there to represent human reason. And he's guiding at the lowest points people, and he's sort of explaining what's happening in the lowest parts of hell, and there are 9 levels of the Inferno of hell. And then he will lead us all the way through the Inferno and through most of Purgatory. And then you have a character called Beatrice, who is divine revelation. And the idea is at the end of this period of Purgatory, you have this revelation of who God is. And then Saint Bernard, he was probably the major sort of figure at the time. And in that period when he was writing, he is there to welcome you into heaven. And what happens in this is, let me just make sure Purgatory, Heaven. It is highly predicated on the idea that your behaviors on earth have a dramatic effect on your afterlife and the process of your afterlife. What I think is interesting about this is it feels like limited reincarnation. There are different stages, and it's not a reincarnation in the sense that constantly but in some sense it is. I mean, the notion of Eastern reincarnation is that's justifying the caste system, that you come back. If you've done good this life, and well in this life, and you've been virtuous in this life, you'll come back in a higher standing. You'll have more happiness. You'll have more you'll have more things. And in an Eastern mindset, you rise to a point where you ascend and you sort of go, rise above that cycle, and you sort of join the Dharma, of the essence of the universe. Now in this, it's not that way, but it is kind of some sense of, okay, if this is our earthly existence and we die in here, then there's a second round. And that's what he's writing about, this notion. And largely in the Apocrypha, but keep in mind, up to this point, there wasn't much confusion about the Apocrypha being Holy Scripture. Just as a reminder, the Apocrypha are those intertestamental books that were written from 400 to the time of Christ, that many in the Protestant Church have largely rejected. Some the Catholic Church has rejected, and same with the Orthodox Church. But the Apocrypha was included because when they started translating it into Latin, they took every holy book that the Jews had, and the Jews themselves hadn't separated and parsed those out. And the Jews also had that hermeneutic of these are holy books or set apart books because they record our history. They're sacred. So when Jerome even before that, when they translated the Septuagint, meaning the Old Testament into Greek, they took the entire corpus of Jewish literature and they translated it. So when Jerome translated it into Latin, he took everything that was available. And although there have been debate around books or the canonical nature of books, it wasn't until the Reformation that we see the major split from the Apocrypha. But all that's to say is the Apocrypha offers major support for purgatory. So there was no question about whether it was scripture at the time. So we as Protestants will often say, oh, pish posh, purgatory. But if the apocryphal books were a part of our canon, we too might believe in purgatory. We just don't, because we're like, yeah, that's not really where we're standing on.
So why did the Catholic Church keep that belief?
Because that was given to them from the history of the church. Oh, you mean why do they keep the belief of purgatory?
Yeah.
Well, because I mean, Jim went like this. I mean, I'm sure in that period, I'm sure it has. In some sense, it's hard to go back and recant. I mean, I love the Catholic Church. I absolutely love the Catholic Church. But I think there's some cuckoo beliefs that they haven't really wrestled with properly. And I think that there's a sense of pride of we're the Pope, we're the ascendancy of the popes. And so we're the one true church, the universal, the Catholic Church. And for me, that's been the sin of the Catholic Church all along, is pride. I mean, if I were to go anything, I'd probably go Orthodox if I wasn't Presbyterian. Because then I could be like, nope, you Catholics can't have communion with us. Been rejected my whole life by Catholics. Gotta stick it to them, yeah. Jim's Catholic. Ben used to be Catholic. My wife's Catholic, so I can joke. What else do I want to say about that? Okay, so hell is understood as 9 concentric circles, and they actually physically go deep into the earth. This doesn't show you it, but it shows you if you see it, it often is shaped like a wine goblet, where you see that's not working, or it goes kind of like this. And then these are the lighter sins up here. These are the problematic sins, and then so there are sort of 3 tiers, and we'll talk about those in a second. But this whole schema is represented here, and what do I have there? I just want to read this before I go through them. It says, for those who have rejected spiritual values by yielding to bestial appetites and violence, or by perverting the human intellect to fraud or malice against their fellow men. And I think that's interesting because, again, it goes back to the fact that when we indulge in our human or earthly or fleshly or physical appetites out of balance, this is, again, the reason it's problematic is because it's the prioritization of our earthly existence over against our spiritual existence, which is meant to be our understanding of our true identity. And this is, I would say, largely in our culture, this is where materialism gets us. And we're all guilty of this. We indulge in so much luxury and so much pleasure, and it's so to the point that it's so normative, we don't even think about it. How much money do we spend on ourselves over and against how much we give to those in need? It was kind of going back to the notion, I think there's my sermon on gentleness, I never said, so I'll record it here. One of the things I wanted to end with is we don't have the problem of homelessness or poor begging on the side of the road in Lake City, but we do in Gunnison. How many times have we driven by that person standing at the corner of City Market, and rather than say, nope, someone else will give them money, or I'm going to pass by, I think it's an act of sin to see them and to know we're about to drop several $100s on a bunch of luxury items that make us feel good in our belly and walk by. And regardless of whether that dude's pulling in $1,000 a day, that doesn't make a difference. It's not about the end result of that. But the gentleness with which we approach, that sense of compassion with which we approach, is the overcoming of the very internal, focused, selfish. From the very beginning, I've been defining sin as self-preservation or self-interest. So whether it's not wanting to pick up a piece of trash because you don't want to get your fingers dirty, to ignoring and I'm not saying every time you ignore the dude. I mean, I don't always have, I don't always have ones in my. I remember seeing a comic bit, Michael Che. It was on Netflix, and he was talking about wanting to give to a homeless guy. He's like, I saw this homeless guy, and then he went in to get to his wallet, and he was like, oh, all I have is a 50. And then he makes humor out of this wrestling with this moment of, you're like, yeah, I was going to give you something, but now I'm not because you're not worth this amount. And so what he's getting at is we put a price tag on human dignity. But that's the situation we live in. We all live in abundance. And we see someone who literally may not know where they're going to lay down that night, and we drive by. If that's not like an expression of our brokenness and our sinfulness and our self-preservation, I don't know what is. Anyway, all that's to say, that's aside. The other few, so this is what it looks like. In this regard, sin or Satan is down here in the bottom in bondage, and this is where Christ left him. So those who are the worst go to the bottom. And here's what's interesting about it, though. The first, I'm going to read you the 9 circles, and this is actually, and this is an interesting. The ones that all the best ones were colorful and artistic, and they were like representations of it. I defined a boring one because I don't like to waste toner on things that will probably just but this whole first category above the 6th circle is called the incontinence, and we often associate incontinence with what? Peeing your pants, right? But it goes back to the idea of the inability to control. So think of it from its base understanding of incontinence. All of these are the inability to control our earthly desires. So the first one, the first circle is limbo. That's for the unbaptized. And this is still remnant from Augustine's doctrine of original sin that is equated with baptism being salvific, or virtuous pagans. This is a category for folks who were good, they just didn't confess Christ, perhaps. And what they are struck with, their punishment is struck with grief from a lack of God's presence, which sounds not too bad if you're gonna if hell is where you're headed. That's a pretty good, I would take that. Okay, but I'm sure I fall in much worse places. If you're lustful, which I think again, there's that sense of concupiscence that Augustine talked about, that sense of desire for the other. That's base. In other words, I think these are the base. He starts with the basest, most, we're sexual creatures. We desire to have connection in that regard. It's a part of the way God designed it. You might say it's the curse when God says to the woman, you're desirable for the man. Again, Jim and I were actually talking about this today. I said, it's like a dog. A dog will hump anything. But what God did was say to the woman, your desire is now to propagate, to fulfill the divine covenant in that way. But lustfulness and blown about by violent and endless wind, gluttons. So another tier of badness. Bombarded with rain, hail, and snow. And I'm not going to read all some of them get worse and worse and worse. But gluttons, the 4th circle, are hoarders. Good thing we had that class on earthly possessions. Spenders. So those who are, wasteful in their spending, those who are wrathful, those who are sullen. So these are what the 4th and 5th circles for. But these are all characteristics of just weak-willed people who may want to do better but just can't. So you get to the 6th circle and the 7th circle, and you get into the category of the city of Dis. And this is where violence and what he calls bestiality, and it's not necessarily having sex with animals, it's a sense of the beastly nature. That sense of primal nature that exists. He gets into violence, and this is where the Roman Catholic Church places suicide, because that's self-violence, sodomizers, blasphemers, and some of these are forced to swim in boiling streams of blood. And this is what Virgil walks the reader through as going through these things. So he's sort of describing the characters that are this happening. So if you're suicide, you're transformed into a thorny tree that are ripped apart by harpies. And then if you are a blasphemer or a sodomite, condemned to a desert of blazing sand with a constant rain of fire. Now then you get into the last category, fraud and malice. Now before we get into this, I just want to remind you that this was defining, this was not like people weren't like, oh, this isn't by a theologian, so we probably shouldn't listen to it, or this isn't approved by the church. This is a piece of literature, an allegory that unintelligent people, non-literate people read to them probably, and developed, and then it was put into pictorial versions. So this is shaping the literal understanding of what hell is, and also the nature of sin. Shaping everything. And 100% can find its tentacles even in our understanding of sin today. Now you get into the bottom, and it says the eighth circle is, this is Malborge, or which I think is, like, I don't know what that means, but it's where the fraud and those who commit fraud and malice, and these are the things. Okay, diviners, so those who are dabbling in the spirit world. It says contorted until their heads are backwards and they cry out until blind. Flatterers, they're immersed in human excrement. Pimps and seducers, whipped by the demons while marching. Simoniacs, I don't even know what that is, but they're placed in whole heads first with their legs exposed and are burned. Corrupt politicians.
That's below sodomy?
Yeah, that's below sodomy. We'll talk about that in a second. Immersed in a pool of boiling pitch. Thieves. Chased and bitten by reptiles. Hypocrites. Holy cow, that's all of Western Christianity. Forced to wear cloaks of lead. So, well, sweat off the weight, I guess, with some weighted vests if you're... Schismatics, split from chin to groin by sword. I don't know if that's just once or if it's like a reoccurring thing, but falsifiers compelled to scratch their itching skin. So, and then you get down to the ninth circle, which is the pit of hell. That's where you have betrayers of kin. Lodged head first in block of ice. So I guess your head is in the ice. Betrayers of country. Now this is interesting. Again, this is his allegory. And if you see at the bottom, betrayers of country, what does that instill in you? I better be loyal to my country.
Yeah.
Wasn't, if I may,
Yeah.
wasn't that also Dante's position that he was in, that he was between the split between was the blacks and the whites, and he was excommunicated from Florentine?
That sounds familiar. I don't know all the details about that, but yeah, there was something to that effect. Yeah, and so obviously, so maybe he's taking a jab at his current context. Brutus, Cassius, and Judas Iscariot, to Jim and my conversation earlier, they're going to be chewed endlessly in Lucifer's jaws. Betrayers of guests, they'll be lodged head up in blocks of ice. That's where the other half of the ice goes. With frost freezing their eyes so that they cannot cry. And the betrayers of the benefactors, I didn't look up what any of these really were, so they will be contorted and lodged completely within blocks of ice. I think it's interesting that it turns cold.
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
a lot of ice in
Yeah.
hell.
So, but this is not biblically sound. Even though the idea of purgatory is. So consider how significant the fear factor that plays in out of this, if this is one of the most significant pieces of Western literature. And this is just the Inferno, and then it goes through purgatory and it goes through paradise at the end. So yeah, Jim.
Wow.
So why did he write it?
I didn't look into that, you know? I mean, I don't know.
No.
I mean, I'm not a Dante scholar. There are a lot of things we probably could ask why they were written.
I would guess this drives a lot of religions, especially early century religions, were so fear-based.
Oh, yeah.
It was more fear-based than grace and mercy-based.
And but here's the thing, as we'll end with very lightly, because we're still somewhat in the era, at the end of the modern era, that's what Billy Graham and other evangelists were doing.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to burn? And we weren't describing it in this manner, but that fear factor still, now for different reasons, and I think and I don't think Dante was trying to define theology. I think Dante was taking some creative liberties, and I'm sure there are a lot of reasons that other, scholars of literature could tell you why it has spread in the way it did and the impact it did. But my point in saying that is, in the Western Church, this is a major piece of literature. It not only defined their understanding of hell and purgatory and what the goal of paradise, heaven was, it also opened the door to take Aquinas's writings on indulgences and pave the path for abuse within the Western Church.
So Dante wrote this before the printing press.
Yes.
So how did his writing become so well known, so prevalent?
It would have been still read, and scholarly works would have been read, and if it was about the church or it's about hell, it would have been,
But
I
how
mean,
many copies could there have possibly been when it's being handwritten?
it's not I don't know what it was, 4,000 something, or 14,000 words or something like that. It's not, I mean, it's not, in other words, it's not huge compared to modern
It's
day.
not War and Peace.
No, well, I mean, it's not like 14,000 words isn't a lot.
Right.
It's, I don't even know, it's 50 pages of our of our modern,
When
our
there weren't
mindset
as many
of,
people.
No, I
so,
know, I'm just wondering how it got spread so much when it's 100 years before. printing
well, over
press.
time, and there aren't that many things being written.
So when did it become so popular?
Now I don't know. I mean, in that period. I didn't dig that deep. I just, surface sort of look at it,
I
yeah.
just looked up why he wrote it.
And what did AI say?
AI says, by the way, he wrote the Divine Comedy to find personal salvation from the crisis of an unjust exile from Florence and to offer a path towards spiritual and political redemption for all of humanity.
And that's what you were referring to, right? Yeah.
And the
like
work
kind
is
of
deeply
making fun of
personal
them.
and epic allegory.
Yeah, and I don't
It
remember.
lends to personal resentments.
Well, the tone is so bitter.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah,
he was saying about
gruesome.
all these people that accused him and kicked him out actually are below him on that scale.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about that scale is it puts the weakness of the will as the most forgivable. Like these are the weak people. And then in the middle it puts those who are a little bit more scheming. And then it puts those who have that sense of, and this is where I think the whole notion of renewal of mind, that when it's kind of like Christ said, it's not just the act itself. Committing an adulterous act to be looked at a weakness of will. Plotting the adulterous act. Planning, scheming, arranging, lying, everything within the network of an adulterous act is where the greater weight is held. I mean, it's kind of like ignorance truly is bliss. It's not just a saying, it's true. I mean, if you don't know, you don't know. Once you know, knowing's half the battle. G.I. Joe.
Yeah, if you've never seen it, there is a Western, Western called Purgatory.
Oh, yeah.
And it tells it goes through the whole thing, that everybody that lives there is in purgatory. And
Yeah.
they go up on the mountain and shove them off into the fire if they
Okay.
make a bad thing,
Oh,
It's just kind of a fun movie.
Well, we can watch that when we're done with this. Danny.
So he is actually, in his writing, he's become the judge and jury in his own writing.
Who?
Dante.
Oh, yeah.
And
But he wasn't writing this, he's not trying to shape theology per se.
Yeah.
I mean, he probably,
Shocked if he could see now.
I'm sure, anything you write is always autobiographical. Your psyche always comes out in it. So yes, his psyche comes out in it, but he's not like he's Thomas Aquinas and he's trying to write a theological document to shape the church. He's writing an allegory, probably he's pissed off because he got kicked out, or, he's mad at
that's
some
what I'm
people.
saying. He's using some of his experience, to do this, become the judge.
And he's taking theological material. I mean, actually, the Dante, he uses a lot of stuff from the Aquinas' writings, from the Theologia. And so it validates some of these, but he takes liberties as well. And again, he's also taking from the Apocrypha, which by the time the Reformation comes around, we're like, So this is somewhat corrected in the Reformation, but then the challenge is flipped, because then you have things like the King James Version of the Bible that are sort of neutralizing everything without its nuances. But what I want to point to is that it actually leads to the indulgences. Now, indulgences in Latin means to permit in an indulgence. And the idea behind it is it reduces the amount of punishment for forgiven sins. And the unforgiven sins will hopefully be covered in purgatory, but the idea behind that is when you confess, you have been forgiven of that sin, but for those mortal sins, but you still got to pay some price. You still got to pay for them.
Huh.
So those mortal, what's that?
A purification.
A purification. So in other words, you're forgiven. It's not going to stop you from making it to God. It's not going to totally separate you from God, but in purgatory, you're going to have to work some of it off. It's also considered remission before God of the temporal punishment. So the punishment you have from that sin, maybe in this life, you're not going to receive, but in purgatory, it's kind of like a tally sheet.
But again, that's not the Protestant belief.
No, not at all. And this is part of the, and so, and yeah.
I was just thinking, it's not in any of the Gospels. Who came up with it?
You mean the notion of purgatory?
Yeah.
It's there are passages, and we've talked about purgatory, and there's a video on purgatory that we'd covered in the past, and I didn't go back and review all of my notes, but it comes largely from the Apocrypha, the Divine Comedy, and a few other passages that are kind of twisted around. And the same thing as we're going to get into praying to the saints, indulgences or praying to the saints, or on, so that they would act upon your behalf, praying for, that sort of thing also comes from the Apocrypha. And there's just a little twisting of things here and there. But if we as Protestants took the Apocrypha as a part of our holy canon, we would view these things very differently. But we reject the Apocrypha, so we also reject purgatory, because it doesn't, we lose part of the proof text for it. Yeah.
The indulgences cover purgatory, what you're gonna
So
go through.
I'll tell you what indulgences are, and then you'll understand how they relate to purgatory. Oops.
I couldn't understand you because you put that glass in front of me.
Sorry, I'm gonna cover that now.
Can't hear through water?
You can't hear me through my.
It was the glass.
You want to answer that too?
So
Was the Apocrypha rejected, or was it just removed as not needing?
Variations, different denominations view it differently in Protestantism, but the stance of the Presbyterian Church was they're instructive, they're helpful, but they're not canonical.
So
They were not considered by the divine word of God. Now, and this is the problem, again, going back to the fact that Jews don't have those, it's either in the canon or it's out. Jews have three different categories. Either it's from God, either the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, are directly from God. Those are the ones that they don't fool around with. The prophets are the next level of sacredness because they record the words of God. And so the details about whose communication, all the geographic things, if you can have problems with those, it doesn't really make a difference. The third are the writings. The writings are about God, about Israel. Those are considered historically valuable, but they're not, and guided and represent the manifestation or the interaction of God and Israel, but they're not considered the same level as the Pentateuch. We used to have that nuance. So even Luther would say these aren't, he's not trying to reject all of them. He's trying to say they're not direct. But Luther also wanted to reject Revelation, James, a few of the others. So, he didn't get his way. But the reason we rejected the Apocrypha in large part was because Luther said we're going to go with the way the Jews understand their canon. And by that point of the Reformation, the Jews have said the Apocrypha was not in the canon as considered part. That was an additional category beyond the writings, even not considered as part of their canon. Okay, so indulgences are unique in that they require action to receive it by the church. It was dispersed by the church, so you had to go to priests and other. I don't know the exact technical way of how it all worked, but in general, the actions fell into the category of prayer. So specified prayers, like Hail Marys and Our Fathers, and often in repetition, often using beads or rosaries. And it's discipline. I mean, there's nothing wrong with discipline, but just the manipulation is the problem that happened. A pilgrimage was the other part. Most of the time, the major pilgrimages were to Rome or to Jerusalem. But during the Middle Ages, when it wasn't safe to travel, you have the development of labyrinths. This is, the things that, you go around and go around. This is what that is. That's the center of a labyrinth. So you go your way to the center, and the idea is you're going to the center where God is, and then you make your way out. So it's return home. And then good works, and that could be service, could be care for the poor, but where it found its often and most frequented expression was almsgiving. And so almsgiving was no longer just given to some guy who was sitting homeless. It was given to the church for almsgiving, and tithing and giving. So that's the easiest form. you can hand over some money, and that's easier than doing a lot of work of the others. So if you had the choice of paying off a fine or working 50 community hours, you might be like, I'll just pay off the fine because I don't want to put the work in. Paying off or paying an almsgiving and using money became sort of a popular way. So it introduced for the remission of the sins of the early. So it was introduced. This I need to remember what I wrote here. It was introduced for the remission of the sins of the early church, and it was given with the intercessions of the Christians. So in other words, there was some sense that the early church or those who come before had sins that they were still bearing in the church. And what they told them is that if you do these things, you can help those who have come before you receive the forgiveness of their sins. So it ties you to the historical church. It also talked about, I read about indulgences came from this treasury of merit. Is that a familiar term for you, Jim? In the Catholic Church, the treasury of merit? I had never heard about this before. I was reading about it today. I thought it was interesting. Basically, Christ died on the cross, and then the good works of many of the saints or the apostles all contributed, but primarily Christ, to this treasury of merit. It never runs out. It's never exhausted. It is what is needed to pay the cost of sin. It's sort of like this tank of goodness that covers over all. And so this was the image that those within that period understood, that when they prayed, when they bought indulgences, when they participated in these things to get this sort of indulgence granted, the goodwill or the power or the efficaciousness of the indulgence came out of the treasury of merit, which was procured by Christ on the cross.
Did they just ignore everything that Scripture says about Christ paid it all?
Well, I mean, there's also, you could point to any 100 years of the church and there's abuse of Scripture. I mean, so no, I mean, were they ignoring the fact that everything was paid by Christ? No, I mean, they still kept the notion of a priest mediating forgiveness of sins. And we as Protestants say this is part of the Reformation. We reject a priest being the mediator. We become a priesthood of all believers. So we become the priests because nothing stands between us. But in the Catholic Church, a priest still stands between Jim and God.
Not anymore, right, Jim?
No, it's still that way. Yeah,
I mean,
but that whole concept of the priest doing confessions didn't come about until about 1000 AD.
Yeah, well, this is
It
what,
was brought over by the Irish.
Well, I mean, I can't speak to that off the top of my head, but if that's true, it wouldn't surprise me. But I mean, here's the thing. From 1000, when the Catholic Church, or what we know as the Catholic Church in Rome, it was one of many patriarchs that existed in all of Christendom. Like 5 patriarchs in the East and 1 in the West. And that's really what it boiled to, is the Pope in the West thought he was the greatest among equals, which doesn't even make any sense. But he tried to rise above and say, this is where the locus of Christianity is. And the East said, no, it's Constantinople. No, it's not. It's they held to the Greek roots. So the treasury also includes prayers and good works of Mary, and the prayers and good works of the saints. So it's not, but and this is, so this is again one of the what I would say one of the challenging Catholic theologies is, well, that's arbitrary. Like Jesus does most of it, but some of the saints and Mary, they put some stuff in good. And again, I'm not belittling them as much as I understand in the midst of why the theology emerged, it made sense. They were trying to build the church. If we just think about it from a political perspective, Rome breaks off in the 11th century, just trying to establish, middle 11th century, is establishing itself. It's built, and so where do you start to see? You start to see basically, I mean, I don't know when the Vatican was built, and St. Peter's, probably in that period would be my guess. How funded off the works of the saints, the earthly saints, or those who, and the money that was gathered by abuse. But at the same time, we also wouldn't have the Vatican to look at and see and all that stuff to go on if we didn't have that. I mean, it's not the only abuse that's happened. In some sense, it's kind of like internal abuse, because at least it's not objectifying, it's not like dragging a bunch of Muslims over and making them build it. It was internal abuse, but it was problematic. By the late Middle Ages, indulgences were pretty much were starting to be used after they had built churches. They started using them for humanitarian reasons, public goods, hospitals, that sort of thing. But the abuses by that point were full on. And the abuses of that, in large part, and coupled again with the printing press, is what brought about the Reformation. So I think the printing press, I think it had the indulgences and the abuse of the church and the definition, and the reason this all relates to sin is because when you have, again, Dante's Divine Comedy placed in the mindset of people's understanding of what sin and hell is and what they're trying to avoid, and names all the sins, and then they're participating in these sins, now they need a way to absolve themselves of these sins so they don't go through this cycle of what's over here. So it's the perfect storm. It was the perfect way to capitalize on people's fears, and I think it reincarnates itself in the 20th century. And we'll get to that in a minute.
Explain to me how the indulgences put that in perspective so that they didn't have to worry about it.
What do you mean?
Well, if they bought an indulgence, did that say that sin was no longer there, or what did it?
No, it lightened it. It removed the temporal guilt of it. It was good, or they would do it for those already have passed, the relatives. But it was a constant, the very notion of wanting to absolve yourself and absolve those in your family and those who come before you, and even all the extent of the early church, drove them to, this is a good act, this is a holy act, this is something, and it wins you favor. Ultimately, everyone's just trying to better their way in life.
But the indulgence didn't say you had to do so many things up the cathedral steps and all that sort of.
Some of them did, yeah, some of them did, because it was like you have to go do certain prayers.
Of what you should do.
I am not an indulgence expert, so I'm not 100% on that, but there was a prescription for what you needed to do, and it probably included some form of prayer, some form of fasting, some form of giving.
But if you didn't buy the indulgence and you did that, it still wouldn't.
The system of confession that developed out of the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, is more akin to what we know today, in large part because of the abuses that happened before. But again, I'm not an expert on indulgences through that period or how they changed, or Catholic theology for that matter.
So, someone, a penitent could buy indulgences this side of death and avoid the treadmill of purgatory.
For sins that were, yes,
Covered by that.
for sins that were covered by that.
Pay it forward.
We were always taught that it reduced your time in purgatory.
Yeah.
So if you bought two, you get one free?
Yeah.
No, sure, the nuns would tell us, like, if you say, Jesus Christ, forgive me for my sins, that's 10 years in purgatory was relieved. So we were talking years, thousands of years in purgatory.
And you were 10 at the time, so that was a long time.
Long time ago.
Yeah.
But here's the thing: is if you understand purgatory as a real thing, and what they're trying to do is purgatory wasn't great; it's constant, refinement. And you want to reduce that time. But if that's your mindset and that's part of your understanding of the cosmos and the afterlife, anything you can do to reduce that the church, the authority, is telling you, well, who are you to question it? So you jump in the game and you play it, and this is an abuse. What's that?
Especially do it if you're 10.
Well, yeah, especially.
Yeah,
And you light candles and it costs you 10 cents.
sure.
There you go. That's a lot of 10 senses.
Yeah.
So just so you know, so all of, and actually I said that earlier, but just a second ago, all of this was corrected by the Catholic Church in the Counter-Reformation. So when they faced the criticism of the indulgences that came from Luther and others, they ultimately corrected it. But in 1567, this is sort of at the end of it, indulgences were still there, but they couldn't be tied to money. So what they did during this Counter-Reformation is break the relationship with money, so indulgences would still be divvied out. The concept of reducing purgatory, the concept of praying and reducing the time of purgatory for loved ones is still intact, but there could be no financial, they recognize the abuse of that, I guess. And then by the time the 20th, and these last, what's that? No, maybe they didn't recognize it. Maybe.
They do it a different way.
Well,
Still
what's it?
there.
You still have to pay to light the candle.
No,
No?
Not that.
no, no, sometimes, but it, like they'll do a mass. And if you want a mass for somebody,
Mhm.
well, you have to pay $10 to get the
Right.
mass
Gotcha.
said. So it's still there.
Well, that could also just be a convenience fee.
Yeah.
Takes time.
Cleaning fee.
Yeah, it's a cleaning fee. By the 20th century, they had the Catholic Church had abolished the indulgences, or understanding of them. So by Vatican
So
II.
that created a way of discrimination between the haves and have-nots.
Oh yeah, very much so. And you want to talk about a cycle of poverty. I mean, and by this time, you would have had a far more cut and dry. Not everyone in the Holy Roman Empire, which really didn't exist anymore, would have been living in any sense of piety. And honestly, I don't think it was happening here. I think this was just kind of like still weak-willed. People were still living out their sins. They just had, because you probably lived in a state of kind of you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. But
Was this mostly a Western
we're only
practice?
talking about the Western
The
Church.
Eastern Church didn't do that?
No, the Eastern Church, we talked about the Eastern Church. No,
They weren't influenced by Dante and the
No,
indulgence? and
no.
stuff
In fact,
like
there's
that?
been a large rejection of Western culture by the Eastern Church. Why it is it part of the reason it's remained distinct as it is. Because they're like, yeah, I mean, really, we still have fellowship with them because in the basics of the church we believe the same thing, like the Apostles' Creed. Although they don't do the Apostles' Creed, they do the Nicene Creed, but essentially the same thing. But when you start to get into the nuance, I would say if you go back to my series on denominationalism, the Orthodox one would help explain how they view all those. But sin was one of the categories we covered for that.
So the Eastern Church, if I'm correct, they don't believe in the assurance of pardon. They believe you don't know if you're in or not.
You don't know.
Until you get there.
Well, and I think that's true for most. I mean, I think actually Reformed and true Calvinists, so the Reformed traditions, and I would say to some extent Presbyterians, United Church of Christ who have a more, and we'll talk about that in a second, just in terms of how it comes out of Calvin, the idea that the assurance of salvation or the perseverance of the saints. But if you have a more providential view of the world, you also stick to the fact that some will be saved and some will not, and you're okay with that because that's not a abhorrent sin. I mean, a doctrine, because you're like, yeah, some go, some don't. So you don't have to worry about it. Perseverance of the saints is those who are the elect will persevere to the end. So the Reformation comes about. The 95 Theses, which weren't as radical as what many think. There are others that came out that were more radical, but Luther was addressing some major things: abuse of authority of the Catholic Church, primarily related to indulgences. He was also addressing issues like marriage and priests being able to marry.
He was for or against?
He was for. But for Luther and Calvin, who are the two main figures who we sort of look back to, Zwingli was still there, a few other minor figures, but the two sort of splits in the understanding, we see it manifest itself in a lot of other ways in their theologies, would be Calvin would say, emphasize human depravity. Sin is human depravity. Everyone is touched by it. Very Augustinian, original sin, guilt. But Calvin would also say that the corporate nature of that forgiveness, this is where Presbyterians get their doctrine of confession. We confess corporately for the sinfulness because Christ's work on the cross covers past, present, and future. Calvin divide human depravity or sin as affecting us both in our flesh and our spirit. In our flesh, in our through the original sin, in our orientation, again, so that everything about the person is oriented towards sin. There's no part of us that wasn't touched, and Luther agrees with that as well. But spiritually, we're impaired. Our rationality is impaired. And in the recovery of the Holy Spirit in Pentecost, that helps us recover some of our rationality. And again, if you take the millions of years view of human civilization, not just 6,000 years, you can understand that the last 2,000 years have been pretty dynamic in terms of the evolution of a human understanding. I mean, dramatic. I don't know how many thousands of years ago they were rubbing two rocks together to try to get fire. But the fact that we have the capacity to do what we do now without even going into all the marvels of the universe between health and medicine and communications, it's absolutely stunning. That is, for Calvin, would be the recovery of the imago Dei of the Spirit. the recovery of rationality, the logic coming into the world. This is my nuance, would be that logos, the word coming into the world, is also the logic of the world. The revelation, the understanding, the capacity to understand that logic, the capacity to capitalize on that logic for the betterment and well-being of humanity. Luther, on the other hand, reviewed sin as a condition rooted in unbelief. And he would go back to Adam and Eve, or even into the story of Lucifer, and the unbelief of trust in God, of unbelief in the order, of disbelief in the promise of God. And Luther would see it as sin as a rebellion against God, which is interesting because Calvin would say that you don't get to choose, you're predestined, so it's if you're either in or you're out, and it's irresistible grace. If you're a Christian, you can't resist it. You're called. It's nothing to do with you. You're a willing agent, but you're a willing agent only by the grace of God. Luther would say that sense of rebellion, what remained in the human is the ability to resist. So for Luther, he talks about resistible grace. You can resist the grace that comes upon you. And therefore he calls resistance against God, rebellion against God, or profound distrust in God, which is what he calls a radical sin. The most radical sin is to reject and to say, I don't trust God. Now, what I struggle with that is I think we don't trust God in every, the whole notion of retirements funds. I mean, the whole notion of our Western culture and the way self-sufficiency, kids go to get good grades, to better in your tests so you can get a good job. The entire system is built on trust in our own innate ability to rise above, and I'm not saying you should be lazy and not do things and not, because there are other passages that would say we're called to assert ourselves, we're called to be good stewards, all these things come into play, but that sense of the root of sin being a distrust in God. And I think that even though I have one myself, a 401k, and part of the reason I'm a Presbyterian is we have great pension. We do, we have amazing pension. Does that mean I don't trust in God? Well, maybe, but it's always something to keep in check.
Is it not trusting or not believing?
Probably a little both.
Okay.
I mean, sometimes you say you trust someone and it's not full trust, it's partial trust. I don't think trust is a switch. I think it comes in measures. And I think I think those, they probably stem from the same place. Mm-hmm. A sense of, and I think the distrust or fear of God not fulfilling promises is sort of like, I don't know if God is really going to do this, so I got to do it myself. Mm-hmm. And then again, that points back to the sin of self-interest, self-sufficiency, self-preservation.
But God also helps those who help themselves.
Well, that's a maxim. That's a cultural maxim, not a biblical maxim.
Really? So.
Because there's a lot of people who help themselves that God doesn't help.
But he didn't make a promise that he would take care of you when you get 65 and retired. So you kind of have to do that. It's not distrusting him.
If you really want to go down that path, that's real. The reason you're saying that is because of the current context you live in. You go back 200 years, and your children would be the one taking care of you in the similar way we take care of my mom.
I heard a pastor kind of put somewhat of this context with wealth or trust or whatever is, it's okay to be wealthy, to have wealth, but am I like this or am I like this? Am I trusting God with what I have, and it's not mine, it's his, and I'm a steward of it, or am I holding it and again, to your point, I'm not trusting God. And I'm gonna hold on to it no matter what. And
this life too. And I'm not saying, here's what I'm saying, I'm not identifying as sin, or saying your sin because you have a retirement account. But retirement accounts, to the extent that they are a pretty new thing in the history of human civilization. Because you go back 200 years ago, again, you didn't worry about it. Right. And without all the medical costs and medical interventions of prolonging life artificially, perhaps in a lot of ways. Again, what we're doing, and this is not in any way saying good job, Jason and Shannon and Silas, but us caring for my mom in our home does not cost us anything. I mean, it costs more to have Judah home in the summer than it does to have my mom with us.
Right.
So, but when we see the breakdown of community, we see the breakdown of family, we see the mobilization of family, the distance between people, the self-sufficient, you put all of it together, the abundance or the accessibility of immediate wealth or expendable wealth, we created a system where I mean, the Bible is filled with stuff about take care of widows.
Right.
Because they're in or take care of the elderly, take care of the marginalized. And so this is why when I look at the whole history of the church, I wrestle with this because I think we're in a pretty, I borderline think we're in a pretty damned place.
Mm-hmm.
Because what we think is holy living, historically is like, and I'm just as guilty of that. And like I've said before, I'm about to get my, and when my mother dies, I will have an inheritance. I'm going to be in the same place that many people in our community are, of having more money than I need. And what do I do with it? And how do I, do I save it for the future? Do I pass it become generational? These are questions that I'm sure everyone wrestles with.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little church you can give it to here in town.
Yeah, I know.
What about the parable of
That
the,
Baptist church needs a lot of help.
Oh, good, that's
what
good.
about the parable of the talents? That those servants were told they were given something, did they use it, did they?
Yeah, I mean, that goes into play as well, and you could put that in terms of money, or you could put that in terms of gifts. You could also, I mean, for me, I would put that in terms of those who did not want to share the very gift that they were given. And the question becomes of the parable of talents is, who are they talking to? Is it Israel? Is it Gentiles? Is it the church? Is it, So, were you gonna say something?
I was just gonna comment, the evolution of the family or devolution of the family is an issue there. We have pockets in America like Amish who still take care of mom and dad and grandma and grandpa. They just make sure it happens. And I remember reading an article in Singapore of a senior citizen who took his two sons to court. He sued them because they were not taking care of him the way their culture demanded.
Wow.
And you can imagine the editorials about that and how that was such a milestone in the culture, a shift that was taking place, and they were battling that shift.
And actually, you have that, and then talking about modern stuff, there were more grandparents taking care of their grandchildren than it was way back.
Well, I wouldn't say more, because that was pretty normative back then.
No, raising them
I
now
disagree.
without-
Oh, raising them without the parents present,
Without the
no.
parents, yeah.
No, but that's the system that happened 200 years
That's what I'm
prior.
saying. It's a breakdown of
And-
the system.
Well, I think that's a twisting of the system, because grandparents would have taken care of the younger ones, so the middle-aged folks would go work in the field until the elderly people couldn't do it, and then the middle-aged children would take care of the grandparents.
But Jason, just to clarify this, you're saying that, the IRA came about because the corporations didn't want to pay retirement.
Yeah.
So that's the reason why people had to get IRA.
Well, because the family system's already broken down by then. I mean, all of this, Social Security is a century old.
Yeah.
The notion of retirement, the notion of vacations are a fairly recent invention in Western civilization. How about the work week, the 5-day work week, also a pretty modern. And what we've done is we've modernized the world, and the technology has afforded us the opportunity to have more leisure time. But again, the whole goal of the leisure time is to focus more on ourselves and our enjoyment. Now, and this is where evangelical prosperity mentality says, oh, this is what our divine right is. This is the new heaven and a new earth, and there's a justification there. I think personally, I see it as a flip of the narrative of saying like we've been caught too much in the indulgence of wealth. Why is Christianity going like gangbusters in the Southern Hemisphere? Poverty.
Yeah.
Did Jesus, we harp on a lot of sins in our theological and public sphere, conversations, but wealth is the one that Jesus talked about the most. Not homosexuality, not sexuality at all. In fact, he was pretty generous in his understanding and his grace towards others, and even Dante was. It's only the second level of sin. I mean, politicians.
Well, none of us argue with that.
Yeah. They didn't say lawyers, maybe it's the lawyers.
I don't wanna send us down a rabbit hole.
No, okay, I'll stop you if you are.
I have a question. Where does it stand? I know that over the generations, parents have done more for their children beyond raising them and making them self-sufficient.
Yeah.
And then that comes back in later where the child maybe doesn't take care of the parents like they should.
Yeah.
But we have such a problem with young people today not working and moving back into home.
Yeah, that is a rabbit trail.
We went down the rabbit trail.
No, but I mean,
All right, Alice.
what is the responsibility of you as a parent?
That's a whole huge question
Okay.
that I'm not going to answer.
Okay.
But the short answer is the problem is individualism.
Yes.
The very heart of all of the problem is the focus on one's own experience. And this is what the Enlightenment was about. You went from a communal ethic. So what happened in the Reformation is in the West, society is covered by an authority, the Catholic Church. We question the nature of the Catholic Church. We reject authority. This is why the Reformers focus on sola scriptura, because without some sense of authority, it's not the church, now it's scripture. So, then you move through this period where now the scripture becomes the norm, and as knowledge is growing, and as literacy grows, and as philosophy and all of the, and this is sort of the encyclopedic era where we're categorizing knowledge, booming, sort of philosophical boom in the Enlightenment. But what you have in that, again, is Descartes' I think, therefore I am. It's the sense of self-existence. You have Kierkegaard a little later, we're going to mention him in a second, the idea of this existential self. Well, that goes on for a series of centuries, and honestly, in the last century, when I talk about generational studies, the boomer era, apologies to you boomers, you are characterized by the notion of therapy. And the reason therapy comes up because there's a heightened sense of individualism and individual personhood. And which means the gaze goes from the civic era of the silent generation, focusing on how do we have a democracy, how do we have a republic, how do we have a society that's civil and decent, to what is best for me, what is best for my realization, what is best for my retirement, and all of these categories of all the things we're talking about come about in the last century. And it's this heightened age of Aquarius where all it cares about is the individual and your self-fulfillment. And this is entirely antithetical to the entire notion of biblical theology. The perichoretical Trinitarian relationship was one of constant self-giving. It's never one of receiving. And that was given to Adam and Eve, and they broke that covenant, and they were thrust into a world where self-receiving, self-preservation, this is my argument. The fundamental nature of sin is the focus on oneself over and against the focus on the other. And yes, God has made conventions for that. But in all of this, everything we've talked about sin, that is undergirding all of it. I mean, condition of rooted in unbelief, a rebellion, that's focusing on myself as the source of authority. Depravity, it's the sense of what is depravity? Depravity is me needing to focus on me. I don't want to get hurt. I want to focus on myself. I want to protect. All of the arguments you've ever had with your spouses probably all center around the notion that you were somewhat self-protecting, or you were defensive, or we were any sin that you could possibly construe on any level, even not picking up a piece of trash, boils down to self-preservation or self-interest. And this is the beauty. And this is, on Sunday I'll talk about grace and the fruit of the Spirit. Grace covers over all of that. That's the beauty of the message that comes out of the Reformation, that faith alone. When we have faith, God's grace covers over us all. And
that's why Jesus died on the cross.
Yes, but here's the thing. It's very easy to get into the categories of sin, and I know that I see it in all of us. I see it in myself. I see it in all the Christians. We constantly judging each other. Constantly.
I mean, he gave himself up.
Yes, but he didn't come into the world to condemn it, but we sure do that job for him.
But he put in self last.
And that's what we're called to do. We're called to suffer in this world unto death. We don't suffer. Really the radical nature of discipleship that I see in the Gospels is not lived out in the Western culture. We're mamby-pamby, easy peasy lemon squeezy Christianity.
But didn't Dante do like the superlative job of condemning?
Yes, but we overcame that. We rejected that, and it still is in the psyche. You can't shake it out of it. It still is constant. I mean, you can't have a generational view of that type of, and I think it resurfaced with the evangelical movement. And you don't want to go to hell. I mean, you drive down the highway and you see where if you die tonight, where you're going. Really, is that what God was like? You know what? We've reached the ultimate in evangelization, and we can put some billboards in the middle of nowhere that challenge people to think about their existential place in life. I mean, like that's just absurd. Okay, what I want to do now is in our last 15 minutes, I do want to, so real quick, I want to talk about the notion of, the important thing I want you to realize about the shift of sin from the medieval period to Reformation is sin went from something that plagued you, that you participated in, that you could receive forgiveness from through your actions. And so it was a merit-based system, whether you want to call it that or not, to a full grace system that dug back into Pauline literature, that dug back into the history of the church and reinterpreted salvation through faith alone. So salvation did not come through your acts, just simply through belief. So when you do that, when you have that shift, it completely eradicates every notion, not of what sin is. Sin can still exist as what it is, but the system of absolution is completely revolutionized. And when we talk in a few weeks about confession, repentance, and forgiveness, we'll get into some of that in the sense of how that shifted. But just understand that in a matter of about 200 years, you had a massive shift in Western culture about how they understood their relationship to sin. That doesn't mean it didn't still exist. It didn't mean they still participated in. But what they created in that, when you sort of say Christ covers over all sins, is you also create a culture of sin, or the capacity to allow human experience. And that coupled with, again, what happened in the Enlightenment, Friedrich Schleiermacher, we're going to read a quote from him in a second. We call him our first liberal theologian. Friedrich Schleiermacher is our first liberal theologian because he's the first to start theology from the basis of the human experience. Schleiermacher intuits who God is through his own sense of absolute dependence on something outside of himself. It's kind of like when you walk on the top of a mountain and you're looking up and you're looking at the vastness of the world and you feel small. This is what Schleiermacher would say, the realization of the divine, or the realization of the absolute dependence you have. But that notion shifts, and because then all of a sudden the experience is, how do I experience God? How do I interpret God? And I think that even to this present day, we all interpret sin differently. And we want to put categories of sins and justifications of sins, and we pacify sins. To say, when you're on the phone and you say to someone, I've already, you text someone, I left the house, but you're sitting tying your shoes. You haven't left the house. Is that a sin? You're being deceptive. You're lying. You're bearing false witness against, I mean, in some sense, it is a sin. Are you going to burn in hell for that sin? Absolutely. I'm just kidding.
What level?
We'll talk about modern day views of sin next week. That's where we'll sort of end with I want to talk about the evangelical shift next week and how that affects us today. And I think why we are at a place where I think we are at a place in our culture where sin is placated in so many unhealthy ways, and judgment is at its peak. So we have this reversal. We have this ironic thing of saying, oh, sin is okay. And then we have the side of the church is saying, okay, then we need to judge those who are saying this. And I'm not saying that these don't deserve judgment to some extent, but I'm saying that it's not for us to judge. It's not for us to create these categories. It's not for us to rank. And so that's where we'll dip next week. So what I have now for the last 10 minutes, I just want to read you a couple. So this is from the Enlightenment till probably the 1800s. Actually, I go all the way up to Bonhoeffer and Barth, so all the way up to the 1900s. I just want to read you a couple quotes so you understand how sin, the concept of sin is shifting through the writings of major philosophers. And even though you had theologians, the philosophers were still highly influential because many of them came out of a Calvinist background. So Kant, Kierkegaard, these are two major figures that affect Western thought and our understanding of morality and ethics. Both grew up as Calvinist, and they're responding or reacting against their Dutch Calvinist upbringings. Immanuel Kant said that it's a radical, and he's the one who said that basically the moral, that the Holy Spirit is sort of our moral imperative or our categorical imperative of how we understand right and wrong. That's innate in every human being. So for Kant, we all have an innate sense of right and wrong that comes from the Spirit. But he calls sin a radical evil, whose propensity is there to subjugate the moral law to one's own desires. So again, Kant views the moral law, the categorical imperative, the thing that says it's wrong to hurt someone and right to help them, that thing that's innate to us, that drives people who aren't professing Christians still to say, I need to be a good person. But when you bend that law towards your own desires, this is sin. So even amongst a philosopher who's trying to understand Christianity out of the context of its setting and sort of extrapolate it for the world or for a secular audience, he's saying when we take the fundamental things that make us decent human beings and make us allowed to interact, the things that allow morality and ethics to exist, when we bend those towards our own desires, that's sin. Hegel, another philosopher around that time, said sin is alienation and separation of the individual spirit from its universal and absolute essence, manifested in self-love and pride. So it's saying the essential nature, Hegel's saying the essential nature of who we are is one that participates in the divine spirit, this universal spirit, this universal light. And when it's separated from that spirit, it manifests itself in self-love and pride, which is an expression of self-love. I am over you. Kierkegaard says sin is an intense state of despair defined as the failure to will to be oneself before God, or the failure to will oneself in the context of God. And so in other words, it is it defined as a failure to will oneself towards God. It's a rejection of God. It's a disbelief in God that requires, in Kierkegaard's words, a leap of faith into the abyss of the unknown. It requires that, in that step, that leap, that bungee jump leap that, to leap off the edge of that. When I did the world's highest bungee jump, 200 at the time, 217 meters in Blokland, South Africa, I had to will myself, looking down off the third highest bridge in the world, at the chasm that exists below me. And there's a they don't push you, you have to do it yourself, but there's that moment where you're like, I have to do it. And this is like, I never understood that. For me is that leap of faith that some people have to make. They have to, do I believe in this? Am I going to buy into it? Am I going to go into it? And so he's saying that leap of faith is what overcomes that condition, that intense state of despair, a failure to will. Yeah. Oh, well, maybe not. Schleiermacher, as I just mentioned, sin is disorder in human consciousness. So, in other words, this goes back to the idea that God created out of chaos, but the sin is, we're almost done if you need to go. Anyway, specifically the lack or suppression of God consciousness. So he would say those who live in sin, those who represent sin, are those who don't see God in the world because they've reduced it to their own sense of, their own sense of human consciousness, and it's disorder. It's a disalignment. Because you see the majesty of the creation and you don't feel that sense of, so there's disorder there. Paul Tillich, one of our modern day liberal theologians, says it is a pervasive existential state of estrangement, similar to Schleiermacher, not surprisingly, fundamentally separation from self, others, and God. And Schleiermacher would emphasize that separation of others and self more than the separation from God, which is overcome through Christ, which we don't have anything to do with, but we separate ourselves from others. Think about the political divisions in our nation between Christians on both sides of the spectrum and those in the middle. Karl Barth of the last century, one of the main theologians, sin is unbelief in God or a rejection of God, and he defines it in 3 categories of pride, sloth, and falsehood. So laziness, sense of self-sufficiency, laziness, who cares, apathy, and falsehood, a sense of belief in that which is not true, or a seeking out of that which is not truth. Bonhoeffer, which you're familiar with, he talks about sin being isolation and self-preoccupation. There again, you see the ego or the self rearing its head. I like this one, curvature of the self that prevents authentic relationship with God and others. It's curving oneself towards oneself. That estranges. If I put my needs before yours, that's sin. Betraying the core need of human existence, which is the rejection of relationships. We're called to be in community. I think this is the biggest problem. This is one of the things that we face across the board. You know what people say the biggest epidemic in our country is? Anxiety and depression. But what are those produced? Why do we have anxiety and depression? What is the cause of the root cause of those? Psychologists say loneliness. We are disconnected from one another. We are isolated. It produces a sense of anxiety that goes back to our primordial days. If you're a lone person walking around in the wilderness, you have no protection from anything. In community, you do. It's fundamental to who we are as humanity and the existence of who we are. And if sin is something that estranges us from one another, it means that it separates us from the opportunity. And the last thing I would say is Billy Graham, who says he thought, and this is interesting, and we'll talk about this more, and this is our segue to next week, because I think the modern evangelical movement recovers what the divine comedy put into culture. Billy Graham said it's a thought or an action that falls short of God's perfected will. And he uses that notion of, originally that we talked about sin being the archery metaphor, missing the mark. But I think I think in that notion of Billy Graham's understanding of missing the mark goes back to the divine comedy, goes back to that era where there was a standard for what it meant to be a Christian or perfection. And if you fall from that, and so I think that the notion of in modern day evangelicalism, in the midst of the boom of the psychological self-therapy, the therapeutic boom of the boomer era, you have Billy Graham sort of putting, and I think that his response, his understanding, his proclamation of the gospel is all a response to what he was seeing in the boom of psychology and personhood and individualism. And there's also a sense then of the economic pressures or the economic mindset, the Protestant work ethic that comes into the notion of prosperity or of progress. And we start calculating things and not in a quantifiable or in a quantitative way as over a qualitative way. And all of a sudden, the amount of people we can cram into an arena and preach to and have commitments matters more than the constant, that's an artificial way of the proclamation of the gospel. It's meant to be done over a dinner table with your neighbors. That's the true spread and, replication of who we are as disciples. Mass production, even in our modern day era, a modern day televangelist or internet star, those people who have wide audiences, it was never meant to that. That's not the way the gospel was meant to be proclaimed. It was meant to be proclaimed over a dinner table with your neighbor, with friends, who you're in relationship with, so that those grow and become, strong connections and places of discipleship. So, all right, that's sin from the medieval period up to the last period. I know that was a brief overview. Next week we'll look at evangelicalism, how it changed it, and where we are today. And we'll talk about our current modern perceptions. And we'll probably, and then the following week, I don't know, we'll see if we want to dip into the next. I'll be gone the 18th, but there are 2 more weeks before I leave for DC.
Can you briefly touch on blasphemy, which you said was the
Unforgivable sin.
Unforgivable sin, damnation. Is that what